the number of times a partner listens to contempt in a conflict conversation predicts not only the demise of the relationship, but the demise of that partner's immune system.
I'd love to jump right in by talking about these 4 communication patterns that you and the team at the Gottman Institute have identified over the years that are the greatest predictors when they happen in frequency and don't change, that there is doom ahead. Can you tell us about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and why these are such important predictors for people to pay attention to in relationship? Whoever wants to start off first.
Go ahead, honey.
Okay. So here are the 4 big predictors of demise in your relationship. The first one we call criticism, and most of us are familiar with that. The way we define criticism is that you're blaming a problem on a personality flaw of your partner, such as you're so lazy, you're so thoughtless, what's the matter with you? Words like always and never, you never pick up the kids on time, are also criticisms because they imply a personality flaw. Mm-hmm. The second one is defensiveness. And defensiveness is really our natural response to criticism or contempt. And what defensiveness looks like is either being a righteous victim, like, I did too pay the bills on time, or, so there's a little whine to it, or it's a counterattack. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, well, you didn't clean up the kitchen either. So that's defensiveness, and that's the toughest one to really transcend when we're working on our relationship. The third one is contempt. And contempt, Dhru, is really sulfuric acid for the relationship. Contempt means you're looking down your nose at your partner with a little bit of disgust and then criticizing them from that point of view. It can be sarcasm, like, yeah, you wouldn't even think to get tickets for us, would you? Or it can be mockery. Oh, I don't like this. That's how you sound. That's contempt. Or name calling. That's a big one when we call each other bad words, bad names. Right. So contempt is really very, very difficult. That's something we really need to eliminate from our relationships as much as possible. And we've also found, Dhru, that the number of times a partner listens to contempt in a 15-minute conflict conversation predicts not only the demise of the relationship, but the demise of that partner's immune system. So how many times they hear contempt in 15 minutes predicts how many infectious illnesses they're going to have in the coming year. There's a direct connection between the two. Really scary.
Right.
And then the fourth one we call stonewalling. So far we've got criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling literally means what it sounds like. You become a stone wall and you make absolutely no responses to your partner when your partner is conversing with you or saying something to you. You just shut down. It's not meant as punishment or I'll show you. What it actually is related to is the person moving into fight or flight inside their bodies. Their heart rates go up over 100 beats a minute. They have shortness of breath. They may be sweating in the palms of their hands. They're in fight or flight, which we call flooding. So when you get flooded from a really upsetting exchange, you may end up stonewalling. And that's a good time to take a break from the conversation.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is an indication of what unsuccessful relationships do. Even if people are not trying to do them. They're quite addictive. One person does it and they get caught in defense. Then another person does it. And then now you're both spiraling downward. But not only do you study how people spiral downward, you also look at how people spiral upward. And that's a lot of the new book, The Love Prescription. Now, the opening of the book starts off with this core idea, which is that can love really be a prescription? And if you fall into the Disneyification of love influence that's been there on modern romance, you kind of think that love just happens. Successful relationship just happens. It's happenstance. And then you either have it or you don't. Tell us why this belief is actually detrimental to people stepping into love.
Well, because it doesn't give you a recipe for how to make love be there and last. And we know that being in love has no shelf life. We know from Alan Fisher's research, you can be in love for 35 years, as we are. And you'd like to know how to make that happen. So in our new book, we basically have a prescription for how to stay in love. And we define love as a practice rather than a state that you're in.
So when you've studied successful couples, and I'd love to get into the definition of what success looks like in relationship in a second. Is it longevity? Is it not fighting? Is it not this, that? Because I know you guys have an answer for it. But when you study successful couples and successful relationship, how do they spiral upward? What are some of the foundational things that they have that unsuccessful relationships don't?
Yeah, well, Dhru, first of all, we have very low standards for what is a master of relationships. Basically, it's people who are pretty much happy and stay together. That's it. They don't always feel happy necessarily, but they pretty much like each other and they go on staying together. They're committed to the relationship. And what we discovered is that in conflict, they begin the conflict discussion very differently. Instead of pointing their finger at their partner and being critical, they point their finger at themselves and talk about what they feel about a specific situation, and then what their positive need is, what they want, what they long for, what their own recipe is for being successful, how their partner can shine for them.
Should we role play it, Henry?
Sure. Why don't we do that?
Let's first start with how you shouldn't do it.
Right.
Okay, so you know what? I'm sick and tired of you never cleaning up the kitchen. It drives me crazy. What's the matter with you?
I know. I sometimes clean up the kitchen. Well, what do you mean I never clean up the kitchen? I do a lot of times. You just don't notice it.
Okay, there we have criticism and defensiveness.
Right.
Now we'll do it right. Honey, I'm really upset that the kitchen is a mess. Would you please clean it up this evening before we go to bed?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
See how simple? It's I feel about what? What's the situation? The kitchen is a mess. It's a fact. Then you say what your positive need is, which is how your partner can shine for you as opposed to what you resent your partner not doing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Very good. And so the other thing is that even if their partner is critical, what we found, the masters, rather than getting defensive, they say, talk to me. That's interesting that you feel that way. And, maybe I can be kind of selfish sometimes or inconsiderate. So tell me what you're feeling and what you need. So rather than being defensive, they take some responsibility for a part of the problem and say, talk to me, baby. I want to know what you're thinking. So that's another great thing they do. They don't do contempt at all. It's pretty much zero among the master couples. And then instead of stonewalling when their heart rates get high, they use humor and affection to defuse the situation, to bring it down a bit, bring the flooding down.
I once heard a mentor of mine say that most people speak to others the way that they were spoken to growing up. So we role model. We practice talking to other people the way that we were talked to. How much does our past play a role in how we interact with our loved one, which shows up in relationship, but also really shows up in every avenue of life, our business relationships, our interactions with our kids. So yeah, how much does the past play a role as part of unpacking how we relate to our partner?
Dhru, it plays a very, very important role. But let me explain the nuances of that role. When you hear a parent or a caretaker criticizing you or criticizing their partner, husband, wife, partner, what happens is that not only are you role modeling after it, which means you're going to take that as the standard of behavior and then practice it yourself. But what also happens is you internalize it. And what I mean by that is if you are being criticized heavily yourself, then you're going to end up criticizing yourself later in adulthood. You don't need somebody else to do it. You're going to do it. So if your mom is saying, you have no sense of humor, you're going to grow up thinking, gosh, I better not tell any kind of joke because I don't have a good sense of humor. So you take in that criticism as if it were true, and then you give a voice to it inside yourself that talks to you. So that voice that says, God, you're such an idiot, that says that inside of you, that was a stupid thing to say. That typically belongs to a voice of a caretaker that was around you when you grew up. So we have to work on developing another voice inside of us that is much more compassionate and caring, not only of ourselves, but of our partners. Because when we're self-critical, then we're going to also look for what our partner's doing wrong and criticize them too. When we're more compassionate towards ourselves and we say something to ourselves like, not bad. You did a pretty good job of telling that joke. I think you were pretty funny. Then you can turn around and see what your partner's doing right, not just what your partner's doing wrong, and you can compliment them for that. And that builds a much stronger foundation.
It's really amazing because when you zoom out and you look at the work that you guys are doing, which is most notably known for obviously working with couples, it's really the inner work of developing as a human being, because your partner is really reflecting back upon you oftentimes things that might need to be paid attention to, where you get triggered, internal struggles that you have, even the way that you talk to them. If you're hypercritical, chances are there's very few people that are just happy with themselves, but then hypercritical on other people. It tends to be that they're hypercritical on themselves. So your partner is the perfect mirror for you to evolve to. Sometimes I think as much as we look up to monks and teachers that are out there that are sitting in a cave, it's that seems easier than being in a relationship and actually doing the work with somebody.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're fond of saying that the Dalai Lama is an incredibly happy being, but he's not married. So there you go.
Yeah. One of the things that is kind of surprising in the research is, when psychologists started developing couples therapies in the 1970s, they just assumed that unhappy couples weren't very nice to each other. But it turned out that they are quite often nice to each other, but their partner misses about 50% of that positivity if they're unhappily married. So you don't have to get people to be more positive. You have to get them to notice the positivity that is there. And that requires a very different habit of mind. Instead of looking for your partner's mistakes and correcting them, you look for what your partner's doing right and express gratefulness for what you see.
And this is one of the first things you teach inside of the book in the Making Contact, in the 7 items that you have in there for the prescription of love. It's this idea towards turning towards your partner. Actually, you know what? Why don't you set it up? There's turning towards somebody, turning away from somebody. And how does that play into this idea of noticing your partner, acknowledging them, and helping both people step into love?
Okay. So this came out of a 7-year-long study I mean, it really took a long time to figure this one out because it was so subtle, but also so simple for all of us to do. So here's what it looks like. Let's say you're sitting in the living room and you happen to notice this beautiful blue jay out the window. You might say out loud, wow, look at that incredible bird. It's just turquoise. It's so beautiful.
And let me role play a response. So I can be so self-absorbed in what I'm reading, for example, that I just don't really pay attention to it. I don't respond at all. And that's
turning away.
Or I can respond irritably by saying something like, will you be quiet? I'm trying to read.
Woo,
and
that's turn against. Ow.
Or I can turn toward. I can say, yeah, beautiful bird.
That's all it takes. Isn't that amazing? You know, it's really so simple.
It's turning toward.
It's turning toward, which is absolutely fundamental to that foundation. We found in our 7-year study in the apartment lab, which is we call the love lab, that the percentage of time that successful couples turn towards each other when the other person made a bid for connection was 85%.
86%.
86. Sorry, honey. 86% of the time. And compare that to the times the partner who ended up in an unhappy relationship turned towards each other. That was 33% of the time. That's a huge difference, right? 86 compared to 33. So you can see how turning toward was so important in the longevity and the happiness of a successful relationship, even 6 years down the road.
Well, the other thing that was amazing about turning toward was that it discriminated the couples who had a sense of humor during conflict, could laugh at themselves and laugh together and reduce their physiological arousal. So if you turn toward a lot, you're kind of building an emotional bank account, a buffer. And then when there's conflict, you actually, both of you are more affectionate and have more of a sense of humor during conflict. So turning toward is really powerful.
You know, Julie, you mentioned a word there. You said a bid for contact, right? Is that what you used? A connection. A bid for connection.
Yeah.
And my wife and I, and I've been very vocal on social media, you know, we've worked with a Gottman trained therapist here in Los Angeles. We love him, Michael. And we used your 52 questions before marriage and moving in when we were in the courting phase to just see, are we on the same page? And a big part of our work with the Gottman Method through our therapist here has been getting on the same page about common lexicon, understanding a vocabulary to notice these important pillars, both the things that successful couples do to spiral upwards and then the things that people do to spiral downwards so we can make sure we stay away from them. And this idea, a bid for connection, it's so simple, yet I think a lot of people may not even recognize when it's going on. So just, can you explain that a little bit? What does that look like in a relationship and how often is that a point of contention in a relationship when another partner doesn't see that bid?
Okay, so bids for connection in a nutshell are when you are saying something or doing something that is a request for your partner's attention or a request for your partner to fulfill some need of yours. So let's take some subtle examples. Let's say that I've been working in the kitchen, John's in the living room, and he is reading. I walk in from the kitchen, I sit down on the couch, and I say, what are you reading? Okay, now, he can respond to that in a couple of ways. He can either say, it's just a book on physics, and he'll go back to reading. Or he can be pretty alert to bids for connection, and he can say, oh, it's a book on physics. Do you want to hear what it's about? And I'll say, yeah, tell me all about it, even though I'll glaze over as you do so. And he does. So that's a bid for connection. Another one might be, let's say I'm working hard in the kitchen again, and he comes in and he says, what's for dinner? And I say, chicken stew. Then I ask for a need. Would you mind setting the table? Well, by then, if he turns away, he's walking out of the kitchen. He's not going to hear the bid for connection. Or he can say, yeah, sure. Simple as that. Sometimes the need is deeper. So a bid for connection might sound like this. It might be, let's say I'm sitting on the couch this time and staring out the window. I've just heard some news on TV that's political, and my mouth is turned to the south. It's very down on the corners. Well, I know. John can look at me and say, gosh, what's the matter, honey? And I'll say, God, can I just download with you? Can I just tell you what's going on inside me? I'm just so depressed about what's happening in our country. And he can say, yeah, me too. Let's talk about it. And then we do. And we may have an hour, 2 hour long conversation. So, that's a deeper bid for connection. But equally important are those little bids for connection too, in which we're constantly turning towards each other when the other person asks for something subtly.
I've got another good example, So I remember one morning you said, I had a really disturbing dream last night. So that's a bid. And so if I said, oh, what did you dream? Tell me about it. That's turning toward. Now, if you said, well, I dreamt about my mother and it was something very upsetting. Now I could say, okay, interesting. And I go back to reading the newspaper as opposed to saying, well, tell me what happened with your mother. What did you dream? I'm interested in exploring it. I can see she's disturbed by the dream. I see it as an opportunity for connecting rather than just perfunctorily saying, oh, that's interesting. Okay, and I go back to reading.
Here's another little simple bid for connection. Let's say John is getting ready to get out the door, and he's having a hard time zipping up his jacket. And, keeps messing up with the zipper, and he's trying, and you can hear him making little sounds like, whoa. And so all I'll do is I'll just say, let me do it, honey. And I'll figure out a way to zip up his jacket. It's just simple.
That happened yesterday.
Yes, it did. Kiss on the cheek.
Right.
But, there's just so many ways that we can be interlinked. And can I bring up something, Dhru?
Please.
Yeah, there's a lot of people out there who've heard that you should never be dependent on each other. You shouldn't lean on each other. You should be independent. You should be able to stand up on your own 2 feet, because if you lean on each other, you'll somehow become symbiotic. You'll depend on each other. Codependent. You'll depend on each other too much or something. And I'm here to tell you that there's absolutely no research behind that. It's wrong. The research actually points to the opposite, the exact opposite, that these bids for connection and turning toward are the way of you becoming interdependent. So there is this, I like to think of a golden sphere between the two of you, in which the relationship is built, the dynamics of the relationship, and it needs to contain those little bids for connection and a lot of yeses to those bids for connection.
Yeah, in fact, I think in one of your earliest books, or it might have been a presentation. I've read so much of your material that it all kind of blends in together. But you've mentioned that you've mentioned that the masters of relationship, they actually need each other, and they're very clear about why they need each other. Right? They actually need each other. They're very clear about why they need each other. Yes, they both contribute individually to making that sphere very strong, but there's not a sense of not being unclear about why you want the other person. And this really, this really brings up the larger idea of there are so many beliefs that are inaccurate when it comes to relationships and even just couples therapy as a whole. In both of you sharing this previous example of bids for connection and being aware of each other, somebody from the outside who's not familiar with this ecosystem, they might say, well, I guess that really happy couples and masters of relationship, I guess they never fight. And can you tell us how that is actually an incorrect belief based on the research that you guys have done?
Yeah. So, we've basically studied all kinds of human relationships, siblings, friends, across the whole life course, parents and children and grandparents and so on. And all relationships have conflict. It's just because there's two minds instead of one in a relationship. And the chances that you'll be totally in sync are very small. So you're going to be out of sync at certain points, and conflict is just inevitable, because you're in different places emotionally. And so it's not the amount of conflict that predicts whether a relationship is going to work or not. It's really whether people feel listened to and heard and respected when there is conflict. That there's a give and take in conflict. People accept influence and not only try to express their point of view, but they also take in information and listen to their partner's point of view. And that's basically the difference between relationships that function well during conflict and relationships that don't. In relationships that don't, there's a kind of standoff because they're listening to rebut their partner's point of view rather than listening to understand their partner's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let me add something to that, Dhru.
Please.
The people who are really successful at managing conflict are people who choose to go deeper and understand their partner's point of view at a much deeper level. And then they work on compromise or resolution, but not until both people really understand at a much deeper level where their partner is coming from in their position. So, for example, one person who's listening won't bring up his or her or their point of view at this point. What they may ask is, well, do you have any beliefs or ethics or guidelines, values that are part of your position on this issue? Then they'll ask another question like, that kind of reminds me of your background. Is there some childhood or history or background history that's a part of your position on this issue? And then further along, they may ask, what's your ideal dream here? If things totally went your way, what would that look like? So you see, there are a series of questions that people ask each other in order to get down to the base, the subterranean water flowing underneath that person's position on the issue, so that they really get it. And when people take the time to do that, there's much more compassion between the two people when they're trying to work on a compromise.
So much of this work is really showing people how to be empathetic, not just towards their partner, but towards themselves as well, too. Because when we have empathy, we are more likely to give our partner the benefit of the doubt. We're also more likely to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. If we had a really tough week and we didn't get a chance to get towards our health goals, or we didn't get a chance to work out, or we fall off the bandwagon, or whatever it might be, we have empathy knowing that we did the best that we could. And you wrote this book. I heard you say in another interview that you wrote this book, especially in the context of our society emerging out of COVID and kind of the state of current affairs, which is things are quite polarized out there in the world. And also a lot of relationships took a hit during COVID. Can you talk a little bit more about that state that you wanted to bring in this new prescription into, and how you see a different vision than the trajectory that we might have been heading down?
Okay, so coming out of COVID, first of all, let's really acknowledge how awful COVID was, how terrible it was to be quarantined in sometimes a little cubicle of a space, especially if you live in New York or some crowded city. And what was seen is that after couple of years of that kind of limitation, the people who were already distressed had relationships that got worse and worse and worse. And there was more domestic violence between those couples. Right. But the couples who were, in a pretty good place when COVID started ended up in a much better place with COVID because they now had time, forced time to be with one another, and they found they deeply enjoyed being together and really benefited from that extra time to just love each other and be together and entertain each other, in whatever form that took. So we wanted to really help for our book the couples who were struggling as they came out of COVID, who were much more distant, who had been forced together when they didn't want to be, who were really struggling to recapture any light or beauty in the relationship that they'd had when it started, but that got trashed in some way through COVID. So we wanted to give people a prescription. The 7 very clear things that we saw successful couples doing, we wanted to prescribe to those couples who either wanted to enhance their good relationships even more, or the folks who were really distressed and suffering and feeling very distant with one another. And every single one of these tools was a way to bring more lightness, more sunshine, more energy, just more pleasing connection into the relationship. Not ecstasy, mind you. We're not looking for pie in the sky idealism here, but just more day-to-day, lovely, nice connection.
Practical suggestions,
right, that could just build more positive energy in the relationship, especially if they continued beyond that first week.
Yeah.
So do you think it's a fair thing to say that, the relationships that have that great foundation, comparatively speaking, especially with all the tools, the resources, modern day and age, people being more likely to be able to self-actualize, which also includes women, being more a part of the workforce, being able to follow their dreams compared to the past. So the successful relationships today feel like they can be even more successful than in the past. And the challenging relationships and the couples that are really struggling, that downward spiral also feels like it's magnified too. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Absolutely. You've got it, Dhru. That's exactly what we found.
And I think it's a very hopeful thing, because sometimes when you just look at the top line statistics, and I think that the level of divorces upticked a little bit, coming out of COVID or during COVID as well, people can feel very disingenuous, and they can feel like, well, what's really possible? Or if it is possible, it's just going to take so much time. And that's another belief that you guys address inside of the book, is this idea that entering into a love prescription with your partner is not something that takes all this time. Can you talk about that?
Sure. When, for example, we talk about turning toward, how long does it take when your partner says, wow, look at that beautiful bird out there? How long does it take to say, yeah, What have we got here? That's 1 second. 1 second. Now, can you spare 1 second? Or let's say giving your partner a compliment. Your partner comes downstairs and they've got, a really nice shirt on. They look pretty cool. How long does it take to say, whoa, you look hot today, honey? That's maybe 1.5 seconds. So, it doesn't take long. The problem, Dhru, is that nobody took relationships 101 in high school or college. Nobody learned how to create a great relationship unless they had the great luck, which is very rare, of having fabulous parents who stayed together and had a beautiful relationship. Most of us didn't have that, not to that degree. So nobody really has learned how to have a great relationship. And all we're trying to do is give people the building blocks as to how, in easy, practical tips that come straight out of the research. They're not based on John and me being gurus. That is not what we are. It is the couples we studied, over 3,000 of them, that really demonstrated the right ways of creating a relationship.
I'd love to contrast that with some examples, especially from early on in your relationship and marriage. You guys actually went to couples therapy together.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of couples therapy that's out there that, even if it's well-intentioned, isn't based in research and is kind of just different theories that people are putting together. And maybe they've even had some success with it. But again, it's not based in research, so we don't know if it's applied to everybody as a whole. Can you give us some stories from being in couples therapy early in the day? And I think that's important to talk about, because another aspect of this is that sometimes people are just getting the wrong advice from somebody who is even trained in this area.
Well, let me tell one story about that. Julie and I were trying to decide a very important thing. We had a house together in Seattle, but we loved to vacation on this island in the San Juans. And we would rent a place and stay there for a weekend. And one summer, we actually rented a place for a whole month and took a month off. And it was just glorious. And Julie announced she wanted to buy a small cabin on Orcas Island. And I was really opposed to it. I just thought it was extravagant. We already had a house, and I was just very resistant. And Julie was really adamant about it. So we kept fighting about it. And we got this therapist who, her training was all about the idea that relationships work when you build boundaries between people, when each partner can be separate and distinct. So at one point she said to me, John, just say no to Julie about this cabin. And she has to adjust to it, and just tell her what your boundary is. And I said to Julie, do I sound like her? And Julie said, yeah, you do. Well, I said, I don't want a relationship based on boundaries. I want to be close to you. And so we left the therapy session, and we basically decided to fire our therapist. And we talked about why was it so important to Julie to have this cabin, and why was I so resistant to it? Why wasn't I more flexible? And out of those conversations came a much deeper understanding of both of us, of how nature was so important to Julie, and being a steward of nature was so important to her. She had grown up really near a big metropolitan forest in Portland. And a lot of times the trees were closer to her than her parents were. And I was resistant because my parents had been survivors of the Holocaust, and they had to flee Vienna, Nazi Vienna, with nothing. And so they didn't trust in property, because you might have to flee again, be an immigrant again, a refugee again. So that's where my resistance came from. And when we understood those differences, then we could say, okay, let's try and experiment and get a small place and see how it feels. And if, it still feels wrong, we'll get rid of it. But let's try it. And I fell in love with it as soon as we got a place.
First of all, I love that story because so many people can relate in all relationships. We try to put ourselves in our parents' shoes. Why do they think about, life in a particular way? Why are they maybe, especially coming from an immigrant family like I do, from an Indian culture? Okay, what are the experiences that my parents had that make them less risk averse, especially for me as an entrepreneur? I do have a question because I've heard you share that story before, which I'd love your thoughts on. The way I understood that story came to some part of resolution was that you made a little bit of an agreement. We're going to get this place, this cabin, but then you're also going to keep kosher inside of the home because that was something that was important to you, John. Tell us a little bit about that. Is that also part of the methodology that sometimes when somebody wants something, you also give somebody else something? Or was that just like a happy coincidence that happened at the same time?
It wasn't a happy coincidence. It was really, I recognized, after I listened to John's story, he was actually born in 1942 on the island of the Dominican Republic. And I, as a kid, had slept in the forest at night, beginning as a little kid, sneaked out of the house and slept in the trees. So each of us had these deep, profound histories that really just perfectly combined in this conflict that we had. And so I recognized what a huge, huge, huge treasure chest John was giving up, what he was giving to me, given the meaning of accumulating a little bit more property and how he'd gotten the opposite message from his parents. So I think I was the one who suggested going kosher because I felt so grateful to him for his great generosity that I wanted to give something back. So he hadn't asked for that, but I knew that he was moving deeper and deeper into his own Jewish spirituality. I'm Jewish too, but it doesn't mean the same thing to me as it does to him. His father was a rabbi, in fact, or trained at least as a rabbi. So I knew it was really important to him. So I offered it. Now, let me tell you, unless you, I don't want you to idealize me, that I don't always do that. I don't always make a counteroffer like that. Sometimes compromises are just on the same spectrum and you come in from the pole a little bit on the right and a little bit on the left to a more moderate position in the middle. So this one, you really couldn't do that very well on this conflict. So I wanted to give him something really important and significant to him. A cabin or another purchase wouldn't have been significant to him necessarily, but I knew that this gesture of converting our home into a kosher kitchen would be very meaningful.
Yeah, and it was a big deal. Yeah.
There it was.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Are there any other trends? Not saying to call out anybody particular work, but just like you were using the idea of boundaries-based relationship theory, that everything is about boundaries. Are there any other trends that you see out there right now that are well-meaning, but might be driving couples more towards separation instead of bringing them closer together? Anything else that you can think of that's happening in the space of marital therapy that would be related to that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I'll make one. This is my favorite. There was a psychologist that would tell couples to have a more erotic relationship. They needed to not cuddle. And, they should stop cuddling and stop touching each other. And then they would build up more of an erotic excitement about sex. Well, that turned out to be completely wrong because an international study that was done by one of my colleagues, Pepper Schwartz, found that with 70,000 couples, the people who didn't cuddle, only 4% of them said they had a great sex life. 96% of them said they had an awful sex life. So cuddling is actually a road toward having a much more romantic and sexy relationship. Touch is really important in maintaining sexual interest in one another. That's one of my favorite examples of how people can really recommend the wrong thing.
Let me give you another example. There is a person out there who is a wonderful person in lots of ways. But what that person has recommended is to really, really support a partner when that partner wants to go out and have other erotic relationships, because it will really develop and enhance their sexuality. So you should support that person to go out, have erotic relationships with other people so they can feel better about their own sexuality and then come back into the relationship. Well, let me tell you something. I have seen many of the people who were the fallout of that prescription, and they were in agony. Both people were in agony. And it took a nice long time of recovering from affairs for those people to mend their relationship and their connection again. So somebody prescribing that, it's like, oh my God, it was like, here, let's throw this hand grenade in the relationship and now just sit back and watch. It doesn't work.
Well, and that's not to say that couples who decide to have an open relationship are somehow doomed. That's not necessarily the case, and we're not saying that here. Mm-hmm. But we are saying that sometimes when people really feel that they're not secure in the relationship unless they have another one in the wings, just in case this relationship doesn't work, they're not really investing everything they have in this relationship. And they lose out, because if they're not really committing to this relationship and cherishing what they have, then they'll never really get all the benefits you get from having a lifelong love partner. So that's kind of what I think Julie is getting at there.
Pulling on that thread a little bit, John, you've shared before that also there seems to be this moment where somebody in the relationship has decided that they're going to actually invest more time telling somebody else about their partner and their challenges in that. And that's some of the early stages of what we would later see as betrayal or infidelity. Right. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And why is that early moment so important for people to understand and be aware of?
Yeah, and this was really the brilliant research of a woman named Carol Rusbold. And Carol Rusbold really suggested that there's an important turning point in relationships when there's conflict, when things aren't going well between you. Do you give voice to your complaints and talk to your partner about what you need? Or do you instead complain about your partner to somebody else? And part of what goes along with complaining about your partner to somebody else is the thought, I can do better. Who needs this crap in this relationship? I can do better. If I was with, let's say, that nice lady at Starbucks with a really nice smile and the yellow umbrella, maybe I'd be happier. And Julie, who's kind of irritable and, we've been having a lot of conflict. So rather than my talking to Julie and saying, Julie, we've been having a lot of conflict lately and, we're not having as much fun together. I really feel kind of distant from you. What can we do to make it better? I go and complain to my sister or my mother or some other person about Julie rather than talking to her about it, and think I can do better. And when I start thinking that, I'm on the road to ending loyalty in the relationship.
Some couples feel like they've fallen so far down the hole that they can't imagine what it looks like to get out. And especially if they have kids, there's something that I often see, which is people saying, I'm just going to keep it together for the kids and not try to have drama that impacts them, but really we're so far down the hole that we cannot imagine getting out. For people that find themselves in that situation, do you feel like it's important for them to start with a therapist, maybe somebody trained in the Gottman Method, or can they still enter into the 7-day love prescription and start to rebuild? When you feel like you're so far down, there's so much resentment that's there, what's the best way to step forward?
Well, I think there is an important little factor that determines your direction and answer to that question, which is, do you have any spark of love for that other person? Any spark of love, anything at all. If you don't, if the ashes are cold, then it's probably a doomed relationship, because you've got to have that spark. And it's not something you're going to feel all the time. You may feel it, once a month or something, once a year. But if it's there, then there's hope. So you can start with the love prescription, which is a great way to begin to turn it around. But I also would recommend that if the relationship is way far down there and the conflicts are ancient, there have been 100 of them, that you haven't processed, you haven't talked about, you haven't worked through, all the insults still play in your brain like a looped video, then therapy is a really good idea, especially with one of our folks who knows to help people to recover from that kind of pain.
I want to go back to something, John, you shared earlier. You talked about the importance of touch, and that's actually highlighted in this book. For couples that are not used to it, or usually there's one partner that touch is a little bit more natural for, and there's somebody that touch is less natural for. So whether that's whatever type of relationship that is, let's say you are the partner that touch is more natural for, and you have a partner that it's not as natural for. What are the ways to bring it up to them to enter into a place where they can both practice and also receive touch in a way that adds more love to the relationship?
That's a really great question. And I've seen a lot of couples where one person is really uncomfortable being touched, but usually that person feels comfortable giving touch. And so I would start there. A great thing that Masters and Johnson created was this idea of non-demand pleasuring, or sensate focus, where people take turns really just massaging their partner. Can be really simple, like a hand massage or a foot massage or a face massage, and just really give pleasure. If they feel uncomfortable themselves, then when it's their turn to receive touch, they can talk about what does feel comfortable and what does feel nice, and maybe expand their boundaries a little bit and experiment with different ways of being touched. So to actually make touch something you do for, let's say, half an hour a day, 15 minutes each person gets a chance to get that kind of massage and that kind of touch. And just build it in as a ritual of connection that you start experimenting with.
Let me also give you a more extreme example. When John's talking about a ritual of connection, what that means is a pre-planned way of interacting, either together just with the two of you or in the world in some way, that you can count on. So it's predictable. You know it's going to happen. You can count on it. Okay, now keep that thought in mind. Let me describe a case I treated a long time ago where one person had been horribly sexually abused by a grandfather. So she'd been incested. And there was a lot of sadistic stuff in that, sexual abuse. And as long as she wasn't married to her husband, just dating, she could be as sexual as can be. She really enjoyed sex. But the minute they crossed the marital threshold, and he became family, his being family triggered all of her memories of a family member, that is grandfather, hurting her terribly, sexually abusing her. So when they came into treatment, she couldn't be in the same room with him at all. She had to be in different rooms at all times. And he would have to sleep on the bed, fully clothed under the covers. She would sleep on the floor, fully clothed in her sleeping bag. That's where they started. So there was a lot of work to be done on working on that sexual abuse, which happens to be one of my specialties, working with PTSD. And eventually they got to the place where they could be in the same room. So what we ended up doing was creating a hierarchy from the least anxiety to the most anxiety she would experience with any form of touch. And we started with the least anxiety, which was sitting at either end of a 9-foot-long couch. Then they moved a little bit closer the next week, a little bit closer the next week, and finally they were sitting parallel next to each other. But because she was so short, he was so tall, she had to sit on a couple of phone books, which they had back then. Lo and behold, can't find one now. And to be the same height as him, because being much shorter than him reminded her of the difference in height between her and her grandfather. Then a next step was him sitting in a big upholstered chair and her hugging him from the back so that she would remain protected by the back of the chair and he couldn't do anything to her if she were sitting in the front or standing in the front. Then it was to the side hugging, and finally it was to the front hugging. So over the course of weeks and weeks and weeks, up to about 6 months, they worked on more and more and more and more touch until finally, at the very end, they were able to have actual sex together. But it took week by week by week of building, where you start with what feels the safest and then slowly take steps to make it more and more affectionate and interpersonal.
Yeah, and I appreciate that example. And obviously that's an extreme example, but what is beautiful in that example that you've shared there is that often we don't know what's behind our partner's behaviors and actions, and they may not necessarily know what's behind their behavior and actions. And I love this simple recommendation inside of the book of even just starting off with like a big picture question of like something that I've heard you share, Julie, like what's on your mind and your heart today? Because sometimes those little threads that you get a chance to pull on with your partner are an indication, especially if you see a pattern emerging, that there could be something deeper for you both to explore together. That even doesn't have to be an extreme example like that. Could be something that's preventing them from stepping into their fullest self of wanting to pursue that business that they want to do, or that they want to write that book or give back to other people, or they want to experience something new inside of the relationship. So until we ask, we often don't know the answer. And I think a lot of people who are together think that they are closer and more aware of each other's goals and dreams than they actually are.
Right. That's really, really true. How often do you ask your partner those big open-ended questions if you've already been together for years at a time? Do you ask them, so what are you dreaming about doing in the next year? What's your dream for the next year? What's your ideal career? If this isn't it that you're doing now, what would the ideal look like? Asking those big open-ended questions is a beautiful way to go deeper with your partner in understanding their internal world, which is a very important part of creating that loving connection.
One of my favorite movies is Don Juan DeMarco with Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando, and he's a psychiatrist, and he's getting ready to retire. and he learns how to love better from Johnny Depp, his patient. And he finally goes to Faye Dunaway at the end. He's talking to her, and he says, his wife, right? He says to her, "What are your dreams for retirement?" And she looks up at him and she says, "I thought you'd never ask." And it's a great moment in the film when he finally asks her, what her dreams are. And, that's a powerful question.
It really goes back to this central message that the book ends off on. And it's this idea of the small things. We often see relationships, especially on social media, as these grand highlights from other people's lives. This trip to Italy, this lavish wedding that they had, some beautiful adventure. And while those things are all fantastic, what we often miss is the small things that the masters of relationship are doing on a regular basis to actually create that strong love. And really, in the presence of love is the crowding out of all the negativity that steps in its place, because that's often something that people think about is it that I have to just stop doing the negative things, or do I have to start doing the positive things? And I think from what I understand from practicing the methodology is that when you start practicing these small things that you guys recommend, especially inside of the new book, that crowds out a lot of the room for other things. And you're just not fighting about the normal day-to-day stuff that's there. And if you do, you have the tools on how to navigate it in the best way.
Right. And, if you take that great, vacation in Italy, and you go to the beach on the Amalfi Coast, and you haven't been doing these ways of turning toward one another, you'll find yourself having an argument about who should have brought the towels to the beach. Even though you're on this great vacation, you're fighting about some stupid little trivial thing. But if you're turning toward on a regular basis, even if you forget to bring the towels, you'll jump into the water and get wet and get sand all over you, and you'll have a wonderful time.
Well, a classic way that I've heard you both share about this in the past is this idea of a 5-to-1 ratio. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, I'd love to. We were very surprised by this. And, I thought in a great relationship, if you had as much negative as positive and they were equal, that would be really great. But it turned out that's not true. In relationships where people stay together happily over time, even during conflict conversation, there's 5 times as much positivity as negativity. There's more looking at one another, nodding your head, saying, "Oh, interesting," all those positive things that you do as a listener that says, "I'm receiving you, I'm listening, I'm taking in what you have to say." This, adds to the positivity. And 5-to-1 was the ratio for couples who had happy, successful relationships. And in unhappy relationships, it was 0.8-to-1, just a little bit more negativity than positivity, at positive to negative ratio. So I was completely surprised by that. And, once you see it, you go, wow, it's so different to be talking to one another, and even in a discussion of what you disagree about, when your partner is receptive and listening, nodding their head and taking in what you're saying and saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more," as opposed to saying, oh, And when you have all this no kind of sprinkled into the conversation, it just doesn't go anywhere. It just shuts everybody down.
Now, for those that are listening that are not in a relationship right now, but they want to get married one day, they want to have a partner, they want to build a life with somebody, how can they use your methodology when it comes to partner selection and finding somebody that wants to build in the way that they want to build together?
Well, first of all, they need to look for somebody who's not critical That's really important. Not critical, not contemptuous. And that means not only towards you should they not do those behaviors, they shouldn't do them towards the server that's bringing their dinner plate or the person who's pumping their gas for them. They shouldn't treat people below them, quote unquote, in job title or whatever, any differently than they treat you. Number one.
Or their cat or dog.
Or their cat or dog, that's right. Or their kid, for that matter, with second marriages. So that's one thing. You don't want to see any of those four horsemen going on. You want that person to be not only talking about themselves, but also asking you big open-ended questions. Questions that don't have a yes or no or a one-word answer, but have reams of pages of an answer. Like, what are your thoughts about the political election in 2024? So you want to ask those questions and have those questions be asked of you. That's somebody that has curiosity about who you are internally, not just, let's say, how you look externally. And we wrote a book, the one that came out before this, called 8 Dates, Essential Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. And that book contains, chapter by chapter, a series of wonderful questions to ask the individual that you may be dating or somebody you've been married to or partnered with that you've known for years, but you haven't talked like this. Series of questions about really important topics like sex, like how do you like to manage conflict? Not having an actual conflict, but how do you like to manage conflict? How about parenting? What are your values about parenting?
Play and fun.
Play and fun and adventure and spirituality and your own personal dreams. So there's a series of questions in each chapter that are wonderful. They're guides to conversations to pull out from the other person, also for you to share with that person at deeper levels, the values and the beliefs that really make you who you are. So those are also wonderful. But above and beyond, make sure that person doesn't use the four horsemen, at least not while you're initially meeting and dating. Also look for somebody who isn't overly flattering. Wow, you're the most incredible person I've ever met. And they say that after 10 minutes. It's like, really, what are you doing? What are you trying to get here? You know, I wouldn't necessarily trust somebody on the other end of the spectrum who's so enthusiastic that you find yourself cringing and pulling back. So what you really want to feel with a person you should continue to see is, how do they make me feel about myself? Do they make me feel relaxed, comfortable, like I could talk about anything, like I'm really an interesting person, I'm an intelligent person? That's what you want to feel.
Yeah, you know, I'd answer that question a little bit differently, Dhru. And that is that before I met Julie, I was a very lonely guy. Even in relationships that I had, I was lonely. But since I met her, I have never been lonely. In the past 36 years, I've never been lonely. Mm. And, you know, it's like, I really feel like she's my home. I feel like, you know, I feel so safe with her. And she really is interested in me. She really cares about me. I feel loved and taken care of. And I think that's a very important feeling to have. And I feel that way about her too. And so, you know, if you're with somebody, you know, and, you know, even if the sex is great, you know, or, you know, the dating is good at first, but you really have that feeling of still being alone, I think that's the wrong partner for you.
Yeah. And it seems another part of that is also this idea of really listening to what somebody is sharing about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Oprah has this old quote. He says, when people tell you who they are, listen to them, like actually hear them. Instead, what often people do is they will project upon naturally in the initial romance phase and honeymoon phase. You want to project who you want the person to be. And so you put them on a pedestal and you don't really get a chance to listen to them and hear who they are. So I think really slowing down and listening, I think, is an important part, which also means, going back to what both of you said, asking really great questions. My wife and I, we were chatting a little bit before we recorded this. We were students that followed in that step through the help of both of you and the work that you've created through your organization, the Gottman Institute. And we used a deck of cards that you created. And the deck of cards is called 52 Questions Before Marriage and Moving In. And I've bought so many of these deck of cards. You can look at your e-commerce history and see a bunch of orders of the same cards because I've handed them out to friends, families, even people that have been married for years, who I think it'd be helpful for them to have these conversations because they haven't asked them before. And one of the very honest things that my wife and I did is, and I'm sharing this because I think it actually could be helpful for some people in our audience, is when we were still in the courting phase of getting to know each other. Both of us getting married a little bit later on in life. I just turned 40 this year. We got married last year, and she's younger than I am, but still younger than a lot of what our culture would say, you know, when people should get married. We wanted to be very intentional and know that we were entering into something with someone who actually had some of the perspectives that would allow us to build a successful relationship. Mm-hmm. So I remember on our 6th, 7th date, I said, you know, I've always had this idea, especially after a few of my last relationships didn't work out, that'd be amazing that once we got serious about being serious. So it's not we knew we want to get married. It's that we're serious about wanting to get to that next step. That'd be great to go to a therapist and talk about some of the biggest topics in life. And I've been a fan of this Gottman Institute for such a long time. I'm just curious, what do you think about that? And the first thing she said after she just took that in, she said, I am so game. And that's exactly what we did. Once I knew that she was somebody beautiful. I was super attracted to her. Of course, that was all there. And I said, well, we really got to also get a chance to let these other things flourish. So literally week by week on the dates, and we would meet up at either my place or her place. And every week we'd take 2 or 3 cards from the deck of cards that you guys created. And we'd ask some of those important topics and questions. And then we found a gentleman, I mentioned him earlier, trained in your methodology in LA. His name is Michael. And we went to him and we said, hey, we're excited to work with you. And he said, okay, well, tell me, where are you guys at? What do you want to do? I said, well, we're serious about wanting to be serious with each other. And we really feel that this has potential. And we just want to talk and see if we're on the same page, because we both have very big lives and we want to know, can they come together? And he said something really so beautiful. He said, wow, if more couples took this opportunity at the beginning stage to actually really get a chance to know each other, we would be in such a different place with relationships. And, I had a friend ask me, he said, well, what if you found out in this process that you guys weren't a right fit? And I said, we talked about that and we would have been honest about it. That was the whole reason we did this, is to catch that early rather than it to be drama or fights that ended up happening later on. So I share that story to give a different example. We don't see as much premarital sort of counseling these days outside of like religious institutions. But I think that there is a unique opportunity there for people to use some of the tools that have been built by you and your team to actually even find, are you going to match with somebody who's at least willing to talk about these key topics in life that are eventually going to come up? So I just wanted to share that with you guys. And I think it would be very beneficial for some people who are listening because we don't know what's possible until we see an example that somebody else has done it before.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, what you're saying, Dhru, reminds me of a wonderful case of a couple who were also premarital that came in because they'd stumbled upon a conflict that was really big in their minds and hearts, and that was practice of spirituality. One of them was deeply, deeply Catholic, and she wanted to really participate in the local Catholic church. She wanted, when they had children, to raise the kids as Catholics. Well, she had found a partner who was more or less agnostic, leaning towards atheistic. And he didn't like any religious practices. He was uncomfortable, even though she kept trying to persuade him that the priest of this church was just a dream. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being, not just a religious leader. So they came in with this terrible conflict that was leading them to consider maybe breaking up and not dating. And again, we talked about that particular spiritual conflict at a very, very deep level. And she talked about how Catholicism had really saved her from an incredibly unhappy home, where there was a ton of fighting, there was horrible conflict. Her parents really hated each other, never should have stayed together. But there was a church not far from her home, and she decided to just walk into that church one Sunday morning, and she discovered this incredible community of people that were just so sweet and so welcoming and sharing. And the rituals of the Catholic Mass were very moving to her at that time. She was around 10, 11, and she fell in love. She fell in love with Catholicism. And it wasn't that, that was more important to her than any relationship. On the other side, he just hadn't been brought up with any religion. He'd come from a pretty decent home, but he was very scientific in nature, and he tended not to believe in something that he couldn't see, that he couldn't sense with his senses. And so they talked and talked, and finally he really understood the meaning of the church for her. And in their work on a compromise, then, he agreed to go with her once a week. She typically went twice a week. But he would go on, I think it was Wednesday night, to a little study group, little Bible study group she attended, just to listen, not to participate, but just to listen, to see what these folks were talking about. And he found himself not embracing Catholicism by any means, but he really enjoyed the intellectual discourse of that group, and found that those individuals were being very vulnerable who participated in that class, and he really liked that a lot, and he wanted to be part of that. So he found a side door to enter into her world, and they ended up getting married 6 months later. Yay, happy ending.
Well, let me add to that great story that these card decks that you and your wife found so useful,
Yes,
are available for free on the App Store. If anybody wants, we have 14 different card decks, including expressing your needs and finding out your partner's erotic world. They're all available on the App Store if you type in Gottman card decks, and they're available for iPhone and smartphone. And download the app. It's free. It's been downloaded 350,000 times so far.
Oh, that's beautiful. Sorry, Julie, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to also mention something new that we have developed that we're so excited about, and that is an app that was developed with us and two brilliant genius software designers. And what it does is it helps you to assess the fine points of your relationship, exactly what the strengths are and the challenges are. And you can do that assessment just by clicking a few keys on any device. It will give you a printout of your relationship, very detailed. And then it will connect you to different modules that can strengthen the parts of the relationship that you want to work on, whether they're challenges or still strengths, but you'd like it to be even stronger. And in those modules are little snippets of videos John and I made, 87 videos that both do just a teeny bit of teaching about why this particular piece or skill is important, and then an exercise that goes along with it to strengthen your relationship in that category. And John and I also role played in this app how not to do something, as well as how to do it. And the how not to's are great because we've had a lot of practice in that. So there's like 37 modules and very significant, effective exercises that you can do with your partner or even think about to really strengthen your relationship. And that is called Gottman Connect.
That app you can have on your phone.
Yeah.
Gottman Connect.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Well, we'll put the links to those inside the show notes, as well as the new book has been out there. It's a fantastic read for anybody who's been listening, wants that next step, in addition to the apps. The Love Prescription, 7 Days to More Intimacy, Connection, and Joy. And joy really is the key word there. I've gotten so much joy, and not just in my relationship, which is, of course, the most, if not, one of the most, if not the most important connection in my life. But I just want to say that anybody who wants to improve their communication with their team, I have a team of about 70 people that work in my companies, of the different businesses that I'm a part of. Anybody that wants to improve their friendships that are there, all the same things that make you better in your intimate relationship, those communication styles, that 5-to-1 ratio, that soft starter to bring up difficult topics that are there. These will improve all aspects of your life in the communication around you. And I've been screaming from the rooftop forever since I found your work of the importance that it's made a difference in my life. So I just want to acknowledge you both for really that commitment over the years to constantly looking for this evidence-based approach and studying what actually works. I think that it's amazing to think that if your work didn't exist, what a big hole we'd have in the world of marital therapy out there, and how few resources we'd have. So I just want to acknowledge you both for your incredible dedication to this field.
Oh, thank you so much, Dhru.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you too are making a huge amount of difference in the world by bringing in people like Eckhart Tolle and others who really support health at every level of your being. So you also are creating those ripples that move out into the world and strengthen the joy and the creativity and the understanding in our world. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, guys. Could I ask you both to maybe conclude on one question, a favorite question, one of these big questions that you like to ask your partner to create more connection inside of the relationship? Could be anything, any kind of category of life. Julie, do you want to start off?
Okay. Go home and ask your partner, how can I show you my love even more this week?
That's a good one. John?
My question would be, what is still unfulfilled in your life that you really want to complete? What kinds of things are really important? There's a psalm that says, the very stone the builders rejected turned out to be our cornerstone. And so I would ask my partner, is there some stone in your life that you've rejected or haven't developed that can be the cornerstone of your life going forward?
I love it. Two beautiful questions. Doctors John and Julie Gottman, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us, Dhru.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
It's not difficult to be right. but then you will be right and alone. The challenge of being right is to not disconnect, to not sever the connection with the